The official story of the death of Otto Warmbier, the U.S. student who was held captive by the DPRK 2 years ago, has been called into question by writer Doug Clark, who offers a different view of the events. Now, I'm sure you, my audience, remember Otto Warmier. About 2 years ago, he was the young man that was held by the DPRK for stealing a poster inside the country and was charged with harming the dignity of the country. Essentially, he was there as a guest and decided to carry out an act that was disrespectful to the host. Now, as a result of this, he was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, which is in a facility that would have been better than what the average North Korean would have actually gotten for the same crime. Now, essentially, he committed a crime and was sentenced for it. Now, eventually he was released due to what they reportedly called a case of botulism. Now, when he was returned home, his family had said that he had been tortured. His teeth were all broken and crooked, and his arms and legs were mangled beyond belief. And they were so sad and denounced the DPRK as being so evil, and even had Fox News saying things like North Korea is not the enemy, is not the victim in this situation. Otto Warmbier is. Now, since that time, there has been an investigation which did show that his teeth were absolutely fine. His limbs were not mangled except for a scar on his left foot. Now, this was done at the time once he had come back and after all these claims had been made. In other words, he had not been tortured whatsoever. Now, this new writer, Doug Clark, has been investigating, and he says it's very likely in this situation that he had tried to commit suicide, which is what I had said right from the very beginning, given the evidence that was available at the time. Now, according to him, who now uses much of the same reasoning and logic that I used 2 years ago, has come to basically the same conclusion. Although he alleges that Warmbier was probably interrogated for 15 hours a day, which doesn't make any sense considering that the young man didn't have any information that was of any value. He was just simply a rich kid from the U.S. He wasn't a military person. He wasn't a government official, etc. So this claim that somehow he was interrogated for 15 hours a day makes absolutely no sense to me, and is something that's completely made up by the author himself. Now, he says that given the fact that he suffered brain damage which was not consistent with botulism, the torture injuries had never taken place, it's very likely that since this happened so soon after he had been sentenced, it's very likely that he had committed suicide, and his injuries, the lack of oxygen to the brain, are all consistent with someone who had tried to hang themselves. And this is what I had already said. He's just rehashing what I already said. Essentially, the bourgeois media, as it were, is trying to catch up to those of us who were really paying attention and not spending all their energy trying to demonize the DPRK to justify a more violent and hostile U.S. foreign policy towards them. But I think there's one bit of narrative that has been ignored throughout this entire situation. He went into the country feeling that he could do whatever it is that he wants, and there's no consequences for his actions. He comes from a fairly wealthy family who've given their kids everything they've ever wanted in life, and they've never had to work for anything. And they have always held that because he has such a religious family connected to a church, etc., that they have a holier-than-thou attitude that nothing they ever do is wrong, and that if they ever get caught doing anything, they just say how they repent, and that they're so sorry for it, and but they're still really holy people because they're so close to God. I mean, a lot of this really hypocritical evangelical nonsense that comes out of the United States, which is actually fairly common there. And then one day he finds out there are actually consequences for his actions. His mommy and daddy can't just buy him whatever he wants. They can't just buy him out of trouble. He has to actually sit down, and his privilege in society doesn't exist there. He could not just weasel his way out of anything from his family being rich and being influential in the religious community. And I think that's a big part of what happened here. This reminds me of back in the 90s. You remember that kid who went to Singapore, carried out several acts of vandalism, and then when he was caught, by Singapore authorities, he was beaten with a cane. That he got a caning. That's the typical punishment for something like that. And he acted like he was the biggest victim that ever existed in the world. And the U.S. Spouted a whole bunch of nonsense about bad foreign policy and barbarism, as if going around bombing the entire world isn't an act of barbarism. But it's the same kind of thing. So you see this same kind of mentality over and over again. Americans feel like they're entitled to be able to just do whatever they want. If Donald Trump wins, I'm leaving this country and I'm going to go somewhere else, or I'm going to move to Canada. So if anybody moves to the U.S. to get away from poverty, war, oppression, etc., they're horrible, they're evil. But if Trump wins, well, then I'm entitled to go to any other country just because I don't like the person that was elected. You know, rather than actually doing something about the guy that was elected that you don't like. You know. So it's nice to see that what I was saying and what some other people were saying, that this was very likely a suicide, that the prospect of having to spend 15 years of hard labor after having such a terribly privileged life where you just got handed everything you ever want, to have to deal with a reality that's faced by a lot of people, a lot of migrant labor, a lot of the labor that's done by third world workers is somewhat comparable to a labor camp. It's the same, can often see the same kinds of levels of livelihood, the same kind of living conditions, etc. His having to live like the majority of the world's population is what caused him to commit suicide. Now, I'm not saying that he was wrong to do so or what have you. I'm only mentioning the reaction to having to live like the majority of the world's population. It's not like I would enjoy it, but that's what's going on right here. And I just think that it's about time maybe the rest of the media catch up and try to use some kind of honesty when reporting on things that happen or are related to the DPRK. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.